Hello, everyone. So my name is Ignam Mathon, and I am the Global Head of Analytics at at Aviva. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about how some of the disruptions that we've experienced over the last year have really kind of provided an opportunity for organizations and businesses to understand the value of people analytics in a way that I think historically we may not have had. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about today around some of the opportunities that we've sort of seen presented to us, the ways in which organizations have been able to respond to that, and some of the benefits that I think we could expect to see long term. So if you go to the next slide, I think, if we frame sort of the conversation as to why that we're here, people data for good. When I was sort of approached to have this conversation, I was really excited by the subject matter because actually it's talking about sort of the responsible and ethical use of people data. And I just sort of love that concept because people data, in some regards, it's a personal journey. In some regards, it's sort of the business as usual kind of information. And I think when you sort of start to explore the opportunities around, how we can leverage that information to do good and to be good corporate citizens, to make better business decisions, to sort of support our people in a better way, I think it's just presented a massive opportunity. And so I sort of jumped on the opportunity to kind of explore what people data for good could look like and what it can mean for different people. And I think the backdrop of 2020 and certainly beyond has given us a strong opportunity to do that. So the way in which I'm going to sort of structure this talk is really to kind of explore how organizations would look at people data for good and what that could mean from an organizational perspective in terms of like the business questions you'd be trying to address. I think that I'm going to explore what that would mean for team dynamics and how we work in groups, because I think there's an opportunity that's presented itself there as well. And then I think from an individual perspective, right, when we think about the type of people data that we learn about ourselves and what that journey could look like. And so I think those are three key areas that I'm going to explore when it comes to the topic of people data for good. So going to the next slide, I'm going to start with the organization. So when you think about organizations, people data is really kind of, the purpose is really to help us survive, right? I mean, at the end of the day, we are here to run a business. We're here to be effective, right? And so what are the ways in which we can look at our people data to help us be better, right? And so I think some of the traditional ways that many companies, when they're trying to establish their analytics departments, are doing, the focus areas are on headcount, right? Just, the basic, sort of narrative of who's here, who's left, who's joined, right? Just, can I get a basic view on headcount? And that's really important because it drives so many important business decisions of just kind of understanding your workforce in a sort of basic sense, right? But I think what's happened is sort of in this early part of this year, certainly at the end of Q1, is that we were hit with a massive crisis. And the global pandemic has sort of shifted the dial, right? It's forced HR to come to the table in a very different way than we would have seen previously, because suddenly we need to think of people in different terms. We need to understand how we can support people broadly. And so our response to COVID and our response to our people suddenly changed, right? And so the operational need to make sure that our people were taken care of, that our people had what they needed to support their customers and to support their teams, it really sort of presented an opportunity for us. So at Aviva, we were quick to the response, right? And so we immediately started kind of prototyping and building products that can really help us understand the impact that COVID was having in our business. And that was in terms of talking to our people to understand kind of, the state of play. We were really looking at data in a different way. So data that we normally wouldn't explore because it was considered personal. Employees really raised their hand to start to share in a different way because there was an opportunity to say, look, I don't know what's going on, but I want to make sure that my company has what they need to support me. And so being able to do work and analysis that really looked at, primarily because of our business, we're global, but looking at sort of our footprint in terms of, office locations and people that were distanced from home and sort of the impact that COVID was having in different markets and what that looked like, it really allowed us to explore opportunities in a way that we haven't in the past, right? And so our operational reporting really took a different turn because we needed to understand the impact that COVID was having in various markets, the impact it had to our office locations, the impact it had on teams, as well, whether or not our people had the information that they needed. Did they have the right IT kit? We really had to get into sort of, almost an all hands on deck mentality. And so the data was no longer just around, like a cost management tool, but suddenly it became around making sure our people were secure. And it also opened up an opportunity for us to start to explore health data, right? Information about employees' personal conditions, right? And so there was a boundary that kind of happened that we sort of started to explore because suddenly, COVID forced us into everyone's homes, right? COVID forced us to understand dynamics in the household in terms of, how many of our people are carers, how many of our people had housing situations that made it easy to establish a home office, right? There was a border that suddenly we had to push, and I think on both sides of the fence, the team was, our people as well as the organization started to really explore that. And so I think, initially prior to the crisis, if you had asked people, could we look at using your home address or information about where you live, there would have been a sort of a natural nervousness around us to say, well, why? Why do you need to use that information? But COVID provided the backdrop that said, suddenly that became quite important to understand. And also looking for information from us is, do you have the latest understanding about what the government is saying and government guidelines? And can you help us rationalize and make sense of that? And sort of, what's the footprint on essential workers? How many of our employees were supporting or had essential workers in their household? All of that information became something that was more available and something that people comfortably shared and that we can start to leverage to make people-based decisions, but really for the benefit of everyone. And so I think that became quite interesting. I think what we're seeing now in the market as well, I'm based in the UK, and so our government has something called an NHS Test and Trace app, and NHS is the healthcare provider, one of the national healthcare providers. And there's information around, people's kind of footprints, right? And so some of the questions are around how we explore some of that information and whether we consider doing that internally. Now if you enter a lot of locations, you're taking daily temperature checks, right? And so there's a question around how much of this personal information about employee health or employee conditions on a sort of day-to-day basis do you want to look into? I know a lot of our employees who are in caring responsibilities, right? There's situations where people historically, because we don't mandate that employees share that, we sort of leave it up to them. But some of that information now you're starting to sort of question and challenge, well, do we need to consider mandating that because of how important the information is, right, in terms of making sure people are safe and secure? And so that information is also something that we are exploring, right? Information around childcare and caring responsibilities. There's just more detail about employees that are just becoming a lot more open, and I think it presents an opportunity for us to consider just as an organization as to kind of how we want to push that boundary, and then sort of the communities we operate in, right? So there is an element of getting employee data and looking at that to understand kind of where people are operationally, but their ability to perform is also tied to the communities. And so information that we're also exploring is information around, what are the communities looking like? And so if I think about how we explore COVID and how we responded to that, we had to look at data in a very different way. We had to take people data and contextualize that. And so information around the healthcare environment of different communities really had an impact as to kind of COVID responses and recovery. We had to explore education because, a lot of employees who had homeschooling responsibilities had to factor in what that looked like. And being able to provide support. And so there's an economic element that sort of touched into the response as well. Housing also factored into that because we're asking employees who are, customer facing to work from home. And in some cases that was an easy transition and sometimes it wasn't. Domestic abuse was a topic that was on the table and numbers were increasing. And so what's the impact on an employee's ability to deliver when you have these sort of challenges that you might not have had previously? And so all of that becomes an opportunity for us to explore. Again, it's all personal data, and it's one of those things where there's a constant negotiation. But our response to COVID was quite strong, and our employees were very grateful for that because I think we just had an open conversation and we just asked, something of this magnitude sort of shows up, and there aren't always sort of guidelines in place. And so some of this is just a direct conversation. And so like I said, we were able to provide quick responses in terms of data around COVID to sort of support our people and to support management in making operational decisions, and then conversations how we manage under these sort of times. And so that's kind of where I think people data for good for organizations is going to continue to grow. I think the mandate for HR to step up as an organization has sort of just fallen into our laps with COVID, and so I think it does present an opportunity for us to sort of step into the space in a stronger way, and to be a lot more strategic, and to be comfortable to be strategic, because the information finally is one of just not just people in terms of cost, but people in terms of support and people just as whole human beings. And so I think the health of our people has stepped up. So yeah, so I think that's one thing that I think is interesting, is that boundary between what we share, what we explore, what we analyze when it comes to people data has sort of emerged as on the backdrop of COVID. And so the second area that I like to explore on the next slide is what's that done to team dynamics, right? So the second disruption that sort of fell into everyone's laps and that kind of hit in a big way was Black Lives Matter. So suddenly you have this backdrop of a pandemic that calls into question so many challenges in and of itself, in terms of healthcare and how we respond to issues, and sort of depending on the different sort of global responses to the pandemic. And then you add another sort of bubbling issue that's been there for a long time, obviously, but I think the movement sort of kicked off with the death of George Floyd, and it called into question so many other factors, right? Systemic racism is on the table, the dynamic in the U.S. in terms of the Americans having to now figure out how far they're going to take sort of their racial narrative, and how to cope with that, and then the impact obviously of that globally. And so what that does is it means that employees are looking at their teams in a different way, right? So where you couldn't have got away with maybe not talking about race, or not dealing with race, or not having to consider people sort of on racial terms, it's one of those situations where you can no longer ignore that. You have to recognize that the demographics of your people take on a different shape, right? And so the need to explore that information in a more meaningful way, and get more robust around it, has certainly come to the table. And so there's been work that we've been doing around getting our people to share information with us internally, to be more comfortable raising those conversations. We've had a lot of discussions internally. We've had a lot of sessions where we've put that, we've put it out there on the table to say, look, this is a topic we need to address. I won't lie, it's a challenging thing to do, because it's a difficult conversation, and in many cases, not everyone is equipped to have these difficult discussions, because there's so much data that has to sort of be pulled into the mix and to be contextualized. But again, that's people data, right? It's data about our history, it's data about the current state of our people today, and how they define themselves and how they want to engage. So there's a lot of demographic data that we're exploring. It then falls into question, when you're trying to understand demographic data, then you need to put it in context, right? In terms of, well, what else does that mean? And so there's personality information that you're discovering, right? Which is how people like to talk about challenging things or deal with sort of various issues, and what that means in terms of those dynamics. And I think adding that racial context to it changes the way we have to think about some of these personality tests. And so the question now becomes, how much of that information do you want to start exploring, and how do you want to leverage that? Right. And so that's some of the things that we're looking into, because we can't sort of ignore and separate that people are these complex beings, and there's so much information about us that we need to start considering, and to kind of explore, to say, well, how do we use that, and how do we share that amongst teams? So I know that there's a lot of times where we look at employee listening, and we look at it in isolation. But what we've discovered through the Black Lives Matter movement and some of the work that we've done is, when we can ask employees to share their stories, that it starts to drive empathy in the organization, right? The more people share their experiences, the more it starts to shift the dial a little bit. And so there's an element of, yes, I can report on stats of demographics, we can report on stats of personality information, but actually getting people to create content and to create the information to share with others is also equally powerful. So it's the type of people data that we're actually exploring, which is sort of employee generated, that we then share with the employees, and how we do that in a way that is respectful of the employees without creating that pressure. There's functional diversity, right, that we've also sort of explored, which is within different team dynamics, there's different personalities that emerge and different sort of roles in which people take. How much of that is tied to the historical context around race, and how much of that is inherent and natural to sort of other dynamics. And so exploring what that means and implications of that when you think about team dynamics and performance in an environment like this. And so all of this just means that the boundary of people data and the ethical dynamic of that changes quite a lot. Even how we assess teams and high-performing teams and high-quality teams. There's an opportunity to sort of rethink that, just because of the complexity that we've seen. I think it's been quite interesting when we think about teams now. Before there was an element of you walking into an office, and most of these teams have an opportunity to engage with one another on a personal level, and that adds an element to the team structure. Many of us are having to be virtual, like this conference, and so what does that do to team dynamics, and how much of that is impacted by the cultural context in which some of our team members are a part of, and so having to just explore ways of working from the perspective of just team dynamics in this environment has been quite interesting. We are exploring quite a lot in that space, actually, and so we're testing different areas in which we're piloting information around employees and how we segment employees. So there's amazing analysis that we're doing in that space. It's still early days because we're still looking at the impact of the backdrop that we're in versus kind of like a new norm. So quite cautious about how we sort of present those findings. But we are seeing that there is a shift in team dynamics and how we think about team dynamics happening, and that we are very much monitoring at the moment because of the implications that it could have to how we think about performance on those terms. So those are some of the things that we think about from a sort of team perspective that I think is quite interesting. And the next slide, I think, is where we start to look at people data, but from the perspective of an individual. So, as an individual, you've got so much information that's personal to you, and you decide what you share, right? You're in control. Well, to a large extent. And so some of that is around how do you support leaders in the right way? And how do you acknowledge that your own personal bias? So it'd be wonderful to believe that all employees are coming from the same space and are quite comfortable, learning about themselves and seeing themselves sort of in an objective manner. And sometimes what we're discovering, because we are taking people and looking at them in this interesting backdrop, is that the crisis of the global pandemic and the backdrop of Black Lives Matter means that our leaders are forced into a situation that is so difficult. And how do you ensure that your leadership is in a position to support your people, being mindful of the fact that all of us have a natural bias, right? And we're working through that. And so how we use data to sort of consider that. And so how do we provide information to our leaders that isn't necessarily something that we might share broadly, but that we might share with them, right? In terms of just a check-in, or, hey, by the way, are you aware that, you might need to take some time, just to support you, right? Not as a metric in terms of something that I report, internally, but giving leaders information about themselves and assessing them. And so we're exploring different opportunities and functionality to do that, because I think in a situation like this where everyone kind of jumps into autopilot and is trying their best to navigate these uncertain times, it does help sometimes to have information specific to your condition that helps you to sort of assess yourself. And that isn't just sort of manager driven or 360 feedback, but that is based on your patterns. And I think because we are working virtually, there is an opportunity for us to explore that, because we can look at connections in a different way. We can start to assess information in a different way. I think on an individual basis, the concept of health, I think, becomes quite interesting, because it's a very broad term. There's an element of your physical health, your emotional, mental health, and your sort of, organizational health in terms of how you're navigating in the organization. So all of that becomes a part of the conversation. And so how do we look at that information in a really holistic way and leverage some of that information to understand kind of what that means? And again, there's ethical boundaries around that, which is, again, some of this is quite personal. Some of this changes and fluctuates on a certain basis, right? And so, how do we put that into context for the individual, but as well as an organization? And I think that's where, again, it's quite difficult. So our rules around how we think about, employee health and employee health information, and kind of what we would want to analyze and do that, and how we would want to look at it ethically becomes important. And so again, this is information where, you have conversations with your people and you ask, are you comfortable sharing this information? Are you comfortable if we use this information? And as long as you're sort of very transparent about that, I think getting people to open up and share is easier than I think people initially expect. I think, we're always very transparent with our workforce. And so anytime we're undertaking any sort of project or initiative, you're always very transparent about the rationale behind that. And so that, again, drives an employee trust. But all of this, again, is information where I think prior to the disruptions that we've seen this year, we might not have been as comfortable testing and exploring. But given the dynamic and given sort of where we are today, there's such a need to sort of want to embrace new technologies that are going to support people's understanding of difference in a meaningful way. Capability is something we are now having to assess in very concrete terms. I think there's always been this challenge, right? You think of human capital as sort of very intangible and therefore hard to define. And the reality is we're in a space now where we can no longer sort of be unclear about what we mean and on what basis that we're looking at capability. And so that's something, again, that we are pushing ahead to define in very concrete terms. Again, there's always assumptions and biases baked into how we define capability, but that becomes information that we need to sort of bake into how employees think of themselves. And so there's now an element of individual assessment that needs to happen in conversation, but then also then how we scale that up so that we can really think about, leadership and what good leadership looks like in a situation like this. And so, how we've been able to lead in these times is something that we've been sort of, exploring in really concrete terms, because this is such a new world for us. And so I think when I kind of look at all those elements that I've just described, which is quite a lot, it just means that I think people data and people analytics really is sort of in a very sort of precious place, because it just means that there's such a mandate to understand our workforce in a way that we could have gotten away with in the past of sort of not getting into some of the detail because the pressure and sort of the environment meant that you could kind of blame it on technology or you can push it onto process. But a global pandemic, a Black Lives Matter, these are very much people-related issues. And so the need to really understand people and performance in a meaningful way is where I think we get to shine. And so I think if people analytics and sort of the industry steps into this space and kind of shows the value within, again, every organization will be in a different place on their sort of maturity. But I think you really can demonstrate the value for your organization. So I definitely think it's our time. And I'm hoping to see great things, I guess, from other teams as well. But yeah, this is sort of the mental space that I think we are currently. And so, so that's my presentation for today. And I would love to get questions.
That was fantastic. And there's so much that I wanted to ask you, but we only have time for one. And this is, so you mentioned everything from COVID data to how people are at home, I don't forget the word that you use, care requirements or something like that. And so there's a lot of, so there's a lot of data, health data, all this. So the governance around this, like who's making the decision? I can't imagine it's you in a room saying, "Hey, that sounds good. Let's do that." I imagine there's governance around that, certain guidelines. Can you just briefly describe what that looks like? Is there a committee, and if so, how frequently do you meet? Who's in it? Can you just give a quick snapshot of that?
So within my team, there's a data governance pillar. And so anytime we look at people data, we start first with sort of the regulation, where global, so every market has a different position on what that looks like. But that helps us understand the boundary of information that I have easily available to me. And then therefore, if there's gaps of getting more information, then what the process would be to sort of, acquire that. So I think our starting point is always sort of what's the regulation. And then once we sort of get clarity as to what we can use, what we can't use, what we can go after, what we can't go after, and then a call is made as to how we use it. And you've got to be quite clear in terms of how you plan to use it and what questions you're trying to solve for. So it's never just a case of sort of playing with the information. There's always clarity around what you're trying to achieve and what you think the data is going to tell you. So that's why I think there's always a bit of a relationship between looking at health data to be really clear what decisions you're going to make, because you don't want to fall into bias, right? You don't want people to feel like once you have access to their health information, then suddenly that means that they are no longer in a position to, engage with their organization in the way that they were expecting, right? So you don't want that to become a new form of bias or discrimination. But you're making it clear as to why that information is important. So understanding care responsibilities helps to understand capacity, helps to understand operational support. So do you need more support, or do you have the right kit in order to navigate? So all of that is just around, do you have what is required to do your job? And how we support you and how we create a program that's just sort of fit for purpose.
Well, Angela, you're a rock star. I'm so glad you prioritized this and shared. I want to invite you, if you're so inclined, to go deeper on these topics on my podcast, particularly on Black Lives Matter. What your perspective is, being based in Europe, on what's happening in the U.S. and how that's influencing, what's happening there in the U.K. and beyond. I'm particularly interested in that because there's so much opportunity embedded within that. And I believe, and it sounds like you, that we have not only an opportunity to do something positive in this realm, but we have a responsibility to do so. So, good for you. And thank you for sharing. I really, really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Al. Thanks for having me.